Welcome to the Goretti Publications podcast. This is Donald Goodman. This is Season 1, Episode 7, Historical Poetry. But before we begin, let me remind you, Goretti Publications is a small publishing house that produces both original and reprinted works of all types, including theology, philosophy, spirituality, history, and a large quantity of original poetry. Our website is gorettipub.org. We can also be found on Mastodon, Twitter, and Blue Sky. Please consider subscribing to our RSS or Atom feeds. And now, on with the show. We touched on narrative poetry in the last episode, and our topic this time is closely related, indeed a subset of it, historical poetry. By this we don't mean poetry throughout history, but poetry about history. That is, poetry which itself purports to be history. While this is a subset of narrative poetry, it's an important subset, and one which has produced a huge quantity of the poetry that lies at the foundation of civilization. The degree to which this history is accurate, that is, to which it correctly recounts what truly happened in the past, varies significantly from poem to poem. Some is extremely accurate. Let's take as an example The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. During the Crimean War, the Light Brigade of Her Majesty's Royal Army made a heroic but doomed, one might say utterly insane, cavalry charge on a very firmly ensconced Russian emplacement. Tennyson's poetic recounting of the incident is legendary. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed out with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian, reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed out with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade. Noble 600. The incident occurred during the engagement called the Battle of Balaclava, on the 25th of October, 1854. A misunderstood order led to the charge, which was made by the 4th and 13th Light Dragoons, the 17th Lancers, and the 8th and 11th Hussars. A light brigade of cavalry means that they ride smaller, fast horses, unarmored, and are armed with lances and sabers rather than firearms, even at that late date in the history of warfare. Their chief role was reconnaissance and cutting down fleeing enemy units, hence their light armament. About 600 rode into battle, 607 to be more precise. Less than 200 returned, for a casualty rate of higher than 66%. Those who know military history will know that a 66% casualty rate is absolutely insane. For comparison, Omaha Beach may have had a casualty rate of between 11 and 12%, which was considered unacceptably high, and Eisenhower at one point seriously considered scrapping the whole beach as a lost cause before the casualties got even close to that high. The importance of this as an example, though, is that it is 1. A poem about a historical incident, 2. Very accurate. Tennyson wrote the poem only a few weeks after the battle, and did his job well. A lower level of historical accuracy, but nevertheless true in its broad outlines, would be Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. It's a lengthy poem, so we won't burden our dear listener with the whole of it, but it's well worth reading. It is not particularly accurate historically, as we noted earlier. It completely leaves off the other riders, for example. But it is an incident that did happen, That is, riders alerting the countryside to the approach of British regulars, and even includes historical details such as 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Of a similar vein is Emerson's Concord Hymn of 1837. It contains much less of actual history in it, but is certainly evocative of the skirmish at Lexington Green that sparked the war that gave the United States its independence. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank, by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires our sons are gone. Spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. As noted, there are very few historical details here at all. A green, a bridge, a fight. And yet there is no doubt what historical incident it is commemorating, and it did give us the oft-repeated line, the shot heard round the world, which is indeed repeated so often that most have no idea it comes from this work. And sometimes historical poetry is merely commentary, not detailing historical details at all, but commenting on how a historical event has affected the present. An excellent example is Francis Miles Finch's The Blue and the Grey. By the flow of the inland river, whence the fleets of iron have fled, where the blades of the grave grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the one the blue, under the other the grey. Those in the robings of glory, those in the gloom of defeat, all with the battle blood gory, in the dusk of eternity meet. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the laurel the blue, under the willow the grey. Here we review only the first 2 stanzas, but it is again a very powerful and worthwhile read. The depth of the fratricidal slaughter, the flush of victory and the shadow of defeat, all are powerfully expressed in this work, as well as a hopeful plea for reconciliation that in some ways still has not come. No more shall the war cry sever, or the winding rivers be red. They banish our anger forever, when they laurel the graves of our dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, love and tears for the blue, tears and love for the grey. Again, this is history. While it evokes powerful imagery and symbolism, it's discussing a real incident that actually occurred. On another level of historical poetry is legendary verse, based somewhat in real history, but full of embellishment and story. These are the great foundational works of Western civilization, the Iliad and the Odyssey, along with other examples of epic poetry from Europe, like Beowulf and the Kalevala. No one would claim any one of these to be remotely accurate history. But to take Homer as the most obvious example, it is absolutely true that there was a huge, cataclysmic, Pan-Aegean war over the city of Troy, which fed into the Greek people's ideas of their foundation, their virtues, and their selves for centuries thereafter. Indeed, to this very day. So while it's not correct to call it pure history, it's not correct to call it pure myth either. It's a mongrel creation, historical poetry that is not accurate in the strict factual sense, but which is accurate as the basis for how a people views itself. The Icelandic sagas preserve similar history, but with more historical accuracy than can be claimed for Homer's works. Indeed, much of what we know historically about figures like Harald Hardrada comes from the surviving sagas, though the factual details are interspersed with plenty of myth and legend. Historical poems like Beowulf have even less of a historical basis. The man Beowulf himself, along with the other figures named such as Halfdene, Hrothgar, and so forth, may or may not have existed at all, and the details recorded about them are almost certainly an amalgamation of many different historical figures. But the way that these figures are presented, the manners and customs that they follow, are historical, and the poems themselves are historical in the same sense. They tell us a great deal about how a culture viewed itself, and how it felt that it came into being. G.K. Chesterton wrote 2 of the best history poems of the 20th century, Lepanto and The Ballad of the White Horse. Neither are brief enough for us to read here, but they are important for any English-speaking Catholic to read on his own. Lepanto, of course, recounts the battle at Lepanto, which saved the Mediterranean for Christian use from the Muslim Turks. It is strongly inspirational and deeply historical, recounting the betrayal of England, the indifference of France, and the rising of Spain and the Italian states to defend Christendom from the existential threat of the huge Turkish fleet, which stood to make Muslim dominance of the Mediterranean permanent, and which won despite overwhelming odds. The second, The Ballad of the White Horse, can only be described as semi-historical. It follows Alfred the Great, a definite historical figure about whom we know a great deal, and recounts many historical facts about him. But it also includes a great deal of invented conversation and historically questionable details for the purpose of making its point. But all the same, it's a phenomenal work of historical poetry that should be read, not as a history lesson, but as a life lesson. And it includes the following brilliant rejoinder from Alfred to the pagan king Guthrum, who is holding him prisoner. When God put man in a garden, he girt him with a sword, and sent him forth a free knight that might betray his lord. He brake him and betrayed him, and fast and far he fell, till you and I may stretch our necks and burn our beards in hell. But though I lie on the floor of the world with the 7 sins for rods, I would rather fall with Adam than rise with all your gods. For our original poem this week, we will be reading The Siege of Vienna. This is an historical poem which is mostly like our first type, very accurate historically, though it does lay emphasis on the more dramatic aspects of the said siege, like the great cavalry charge down the Kahlenberg, than the more prosaic ones, like the brave infantry fighting around the Turkenschanze. But it is definitively history, even giving dates and character backgrounds. It is lengthy, but hopefully worth it. St. Michael, mighty angel, sing my song of death and battle that you guided on that bloody day. O saint of battle, you who held the arms of him who in the sign of your great general would fight and conquer and set free his people from the chains which had for centuries bound them. You who stood beside Pelayo at the cave against the endless sea of foes which sought the death of him and all he loved and led him to the victory. You who guided Charles, the one we call the Hammer, when he placed himself and his small force of Christians, now the lonely guard, a frail flesh wall alone which stood between that horde of countless enemies who sought to end what he and all those like him had but just begun to build, and helped that few to conquer, led that petty king to fight back all the forces of that vast expanse which spanned from Pyrenees to India afar, and saved so many people from the conquering foe, which stood with Santiago on that long crusade, reclaiming old Hispania from those who stole the jewel of the southwest from Hercules' rock up to the mountains where the Basques still make their homes, and fought against the foemen. 700 years you and the Matamoros fought to free the land and save it for the Christ. And you who pulled the oars of all those galley ships which sailed against the Turk and came to battle at Lepanto, where the sword of Christendom was borne by John of Austria, and countless nations joined their mights to fight the foe which for so many centuries had borne the curve of scimitar and crescent against the Christian folk, and sought to bring them all to Doaid Huri's fate, away from him who hung upon the wooden cross, the God-man who had died for love of every man, and brought the Holy League a victory so great that songs will ever after sing its fulsome praise. St. Michael, saint of battle, sing your ride to war when Turks again assailed the lands where full moon shines, with crimson crescents tried to drown the light of day and snuff the lamp which sits upon the lampstand high. When Staudenberg, with scarcely men to man the walls, defied the Sultan's will to fall down to his knees and hand the keys of fair Vienna to the Turk. When Charles Lorrainer marched against the puppet prince who did the Sultan's will. When King of Hussars, John, Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poles, rode from the forest with his winged Hussar host and drove the Turk away from fair Vienna's gates, and saved all Christian peoples from the Dhimmi's fate and hateful Devshirme, from centuries of strife and slavery which their dear brethren in the East and Africa had so long suffered with the Lord. St. Michael, saint of battle, guide my humble song, and help me sing this lay of heroes bold and strong. The first to wage the war against the Christian lands was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, a loyal Muslim, shunning silver, silk, and gold, an endless struggle for the Christians sad enough to fall under his sway, the scourge of the Ukraine, a ruler in Bulgaria who stole the town of Koyrin from Russia, who had but of late retaken it from Muslim Turkish dominance. The emperor was Leopold the Habsburg, first to bear his name, the conqueror of Hungary, the king of all Croatia and Bohemia, and tireless foe of all who threatened Christendom. Behind the walls of fair Vienna, Staremberg, Ernst Rudiger, stood with his 15,000 men against 6 times that many Turkish Ottomans, and held them off for 2 months' starving, weary siege before he could then sally out to slay the foe when King Sobieski rode down from the Kahlenberg. Duke Charles Lorrainer, he who fought the puppet prince, the traitor Imre, he who rode to fight the Turk and smote his Turks and Magyars at the Biesenberg, and he who rescued Christendom, the Polish king, great John Sobieski, veteran of the many wars that Poland had to fight against the southern Turks and northern heretics that threatened Poland fair. Born in Olesko in Ukraine, Ruthenia, son of the voivode and his noble woman wife, the mighty John showed strength of mind e'en more than arm, and studied at the Krakow University, and traveled widely all through Europe's greatest towns, a fluent speaker of both his fair native tongue and Latin, that great language of the Holy Church, and German, French, Italian, flexing first his mind before he had necessity to flex his arm. He first swung with his mighty axe to slay the men who rose rebelling at Zamosk. King Casimir defeated them with John as part of his great host. The head of his own hussars at Berestico, he put down more rebellion on the king's behalf. King Casimir made John an envoy to the Turk. He added Turkish to the list of tongues he spoke before he then rode north to fight the Swedes' deluge. When Swedes and Russians swept through all the Commonwealth, destroyed the city Warsaw, countless other towns and churches, sparing only Lvov and Gdansk of all the cities in the land before they could be pushed back to the lands they came from. As he rose in rank, he won a seat as deputy within that house, the Sejm, which sat to give advice unto the king, and soon became Grand Marshal of the Polish crown, and then defeated Husein Pasha of the Turks at Khotan, though outnumbered, then at Lemberg town, then raised the siege of Trembola. Returning home, when King Michael had died, his noble countrymen elected him their king. But John did greater deeds, e'en greater than his victories in many wars and feats of learned wisdom, for his strength of mind and strength of arm, despite their power, were outdone by strength of heart. For ere he was the king of Poles, King John did have a queen, Marie Casimir Louise, his dearest Marusyenka, and his love for her and hers for him is stuff of legend. Oft they wrote to one another, ever were their hearts as one, though distance, war, and danger kept them oft apart. Though he a mighty warrior and she a maid, he thought it not beneath him to beseech her aid and follow her advice in everything he faced, a worthy helpmate in the sacrament they shared, and precious jewel with price beyond the farthest lands. And so were these men poised for battle on that day in autumn 1683, when Europe's doom was finally decided once and for all time, and that for now it would remain a Christian land and part of Christendom, and that the Turk would not extinguish once for all the light upon the world that Christ did shine from Rome, the eternal city blessed. And Christendom would need of virtue her whole store when for her liberation she would march to war. In 1529 the Turks besieged the town, the Danube's jewel, Vienna, with a fearsome host, 100,000 men. The city manned its walls with barely more than 20,000. Still she fought, with Nicholas Graf Salm to lead the desperate hold against an ocean of her foes. For 2 long weeks the Turks besieged the city. 1 in 10 were killed of those who fought against them, and an untold count of citizens were killed in that despairing siege. But though the Turks advanced with numbers far above what Christendom could meet, they could not move their guns and camels near as easily as they had hoped. The Sultan's forces reached Vienna sick and tired, but still in such great numbers that they felt assured of victory. The Turks sent 3 rich Austrians, their prisoners, to the city to demand its keys and all its wealth and citizens. But Nicholas sent in return 3 Muslims as his sole response, and readied for the fight. The Muslim sappers dug, and while Nicholas sent sorties out to stop their work, like fleas harassing elephants. But without fear, the sorties did great work, and slayed a multitude, and nearly captured that great Turkish general, Pargeli Pasha, who had once a Christian been, but captured as a youth by Turks was made a slave and lost his faith, and soon was fully with the Turks, until the Sultan, heedless of his years of faith, had Pasha murdered in his home. The Christians fought, and soon the sorties blew up all the Sultan's mines, and thus he chose to make a final mighty push with all his men. The Christian force raised high the cross and fought with all their strength. The arquebus was loud, the pikes were sharp, and soon the Turks were put to flight, back to their stolen capital, which bore the name of him who conquered in the sign of God's good Son, whom they would all deny. And since that campaign failed, the Turks had waited for their chance to strike again. Had built the roads and bridges so their heavy guns could reach the walls of fair Vienna. Long they lurked and fomented division on the Christian side, delighted that the Lutherans stole their northern lands, ecstatic that the French feared Habsburg power more than they loved Christendom. Pargeli Pasha knew the fears of France, so weakened by the Huguenots, and played them straight into the Sultan's grasping hands, before long docking Turkish fleets in Christian ports at Marseille while the Holy League fought desperately, and won the glorious victory that saved the West from Muslim domination at Lepanto. Then, in Hungary, which they had stolen from its folk, the Turks set up a puppet, Imre Thököly, a Protestant who in his own less vicious way held hate for Christendom as deep as any Turk who did not know the Christ, and swore his faith to them who sought the slavery of Christians everywhere. By 1682, when war at last began, the Ottomans were ruling lands so widely spread that all North Africa and Egypt, Palestine, Old Syria and Asia Minor, ancient Greece, the land between the rivers, all the Balkan lands, and north to Hungary and Ukraine was bent beneath the curved scimitar of Islam's Turkish host. So total and despotic was the Sultan's rule that he would institute, without rebellion's fear, the devshirme, by which the boys of Christian homes were stolen from their families, brought to Muslim lands, and circumcised, converted by that scimitar, and turned into the Sultan's very favorite men, the Janissaries, feared and dreaded. These poor boys, once stolen from their weeping mothers after years of brutal Muslim programming, were then returned to Christian lands, and used to do the same to folk as had been done to them. This cruelest slavery gave such joy to the Sultan and such misery to all his Christian subjects. But for centuries he built up mighty armies with the stolen boys of Christian lands, the men of Christendom knew well what was at stake when that next year they went to war. And so their strongest Western ally, Holy France, had been suborned, And in the north the Lutherans reigned, who even when they did not make a war themselves were only too glad when they saw the Turks advance in Catholic countries. And then to the south and east the Ottomans stood with an empire strong and vast, and Christendom seemed ripe and ready for its fall. But still, though struck on every flank and from within, the men of Christendom were not yet wholly spent. The Holy Roman Empire called on good King John in Poland. Though his wife and sympathies were French, King John knew well that Christendom must ere all else be fought for and be saved, and so he promised aid if e'er the Turks again attacked Vienna's walls. And Leopold the Emperor did swear in turn that should the Turks turn north instead of west, then he would ride to Poland's side. On March the 31st in 1683, the Sultan's message came: surrender fair Vienna's gates, or be destroyed. And so the Turks marched north and westward, gathering strength from other Muslims and their puppets on the way. 150,000 men marched up the stream to take the river's jewel. The emperor then fled and gathered 60,000 of the people too to bring them all to safety. In the city's walls he trusted Ernst von Stauffenberg to hold the gates with 15,000 men, all that could then be spared. 1 Christian for 10 Muslims. Hopeless seemed the day, the 14th of July, when Turks engulfed the walls and started their great siege. Yet Stauffenberg had hope, a hope that even countless Turks could ne'er defeat, and light which nothing could extinguish. Leopold, from Passau, where he'd brought his people, lit the fires and called for John Sobieski and his Polish host to come to his relief. But still, John needed time, and Stauffenberg was sore beset within the walls. The Maccabees endured for long with the Persian sword, and Christ himself had suffered his own body's siege. Could fair Vienna long resist the Turkish horde? Could scimitar and turban fall to Christian sword? When Stauffenberg had been entrusted with the town and knew the Turks were marching up the Danube's length with overwhelming force of men and mines and guns to crush the city's walls to rubble, he declared that all the city's men and arms be put to use if there was any hope of holding till the Poles and Leopold arrived. So he did send his men to burn, destroy, and crush the houses all around the city's walls to make an open plain for guns to fire upon the Turks when they would march or sneak and make attempt to break them. On July 14th, Kara Mustafa sent the message to the town: surrender now or be destroyed, no quarter given. And Stauffenberg at last stood at that fateful point when he must make decision that could cost the lives of thousands, e'en himself, but yet might save the whole of Christendom. But he had heard of Perchtoldsdorf the days before, which had surrendered to the Turk when given the same demand, though they had long held out the last time Ottomans had ventured so far west. Mustafa had not honored his fair promise then to Perchtoldsdorf, and all the town was put to death. So Stauffenberg knew well would happen to his men if he surrendered, even if he were inclined. But no, this new Thermopylae would ever stand. This Christian Leonidas gave the same response the pagan one gave long ago, and readied all his men and guns, a tiny rock to hold the wave of all the mighty ocean. That July 14th, a single spot of warmth afloat in frozen seas, a grain of sand pushed by the countless other grains to fall down through the hourglass, but cries out, "No! We stand and fight no matter how the war may go. If there be 10 of you for every one of us, then we will each slay 20 ere we too are slain, and all our brethren after war's most dreadful course will raise their glasses, honor the victorious dead." The Turks at once began their digging trenches wide, directly toward the city, while defending guns did blast and boom against the sappers and their mines as slowly they crept closer to the mighty walls. The Turkish guns did not sit silent. Constantly they sent barrages at the outer palisades. The men of Christendom, while under Turkish fire, took mighty tree trunks to rebuild the palisades and so delayed the Turkish march. But still they dug, and still the Christians fought like heroes, though the day seemed destined to be lost. The Turks allowed no food to enter that fair city. From July 14th until September 12th, the men just fought and starved, their figures ever gaunter as their hunger sapped their strength as surely as the sappers mined the walls. But Ernst von Stauffenberg, though starving with his men, would keep them fighting to the hungry, bitter end. As men in sore privation fell asleep on watch, he woke them and beseeched them keep themselves awake, remember their great duty. As the Turks did mine, the Christians dug themselves and slew the sappers, slowed the diggers, captured and defused the Turkish mines, and waited for the winged hussars' strong relief which they knew soon was coming. And so did the Turk. As summer passed to autumn, Mustafa well knew the empire's and the Polish troops would soon arrive, and it behooved him to have seized the city first and meet them from its strength. So as Duke Charles marched east, and John Sobieski led his army to the south, the Turks exerted all their strength upon the walls. With saps and mines so numerous, the Christian host could not defuse them all. They blew huge holes in stone, and starving gaunt defenders fought these well-fed troops at Berg and Lübel several days, and held them back until at last the ravelin of Berg was seized, and Stauffenberg prepared his men for that last fight within the very streets of fair Vienna town. September 8th. Vienna very nearly fell, just barely held by desperate battle of gaunt men, emaciated shadows of the men who once had proudly manned the walls. But they were not yet spent. E'en as they fought ferociously against the Turks, 10 massive mines were being dug and filled with bombs at Leubel to blow yet another hole and end the Christian men's resistance at those mighty walls. September 12th. Would Muslim force to victory run? Would crescent moon o'erwhelm the shadowed, clouded sun? Still, ever southward, John Sobieski led his men, and stopped at Czestochowa to beseech the aid of her whose son, whose cross had given strength to men, a strength that rests in suffering and joy and woe. And Duke Charles of Lorraine knew he must help relieve the men behind the walls before the Turkish arms and their starvation lost the day for Christendom. Still, Charles did not have near the men that he would need to fight the main force of the Turk, but he knew well that there were willing traitors with the enemy that he might draw away from fair Vienna's walls to give the men within some slight relief. And so he marched to Biesenberg, with a mere 3 miles away northwest of Danube's jewel, as August wore away. And fearing that the Christians tried encirclement, the Turks went up to meet them. Thököly they sent, the traitor prince of Turkish Hungary, whose sword was always lent to help the foes of Christendom, and who the Sultan gave reward when war was done with land and titles. Riding out to meet the force of troops imperial, Thököly lost the day, and Charles could take possession of the north and west, relieve the garrison, and wait in strength for John, who came e'er nearer to the field of war. The 6th, King John Sobieski crossed the Danube 20 miles from fair Vienna, at the ancient town of Tulln, and there the host of Christendom prepared for war and organized their men beneath Sobieski's flag. Within the city, 15,000 men could fight, and almost all were infantry. Artillery and some few horsemen also held the Turks at bay. Duke Charles Lorrainer with the Emperor's regiments, and 3 Croatian units stood upon the left. The Swabians and Bavarians with Prince Georg and Saxons marched to battle, grenadiers and guns and infantry and horse. Franconians joined the fight, and then of course King John and all his Polish host, his infantry and cavalry with axes sharp and hussars champing at the bit to fight the foe that threatened certain death to cherished Christendom. The 11th of September, Marco said the Mass, and all the host joined all their prayers for victory, for strength in arms against this horde of enemies, for courage in the face of almost certain death. For still there stood 2 Turks for every Christian man, and all were sore afraid. But John could raise his axe, remind the men that often they had won the field when sorely overrun by all the hordes of Turks, and that they fought to save the Christian world they knew, their own homes and their families, and that Christendom herself stood in the balance, teetered on the brink of being overwhelmed by all her many foes. And so they went to rest, for on the morrow war would start and battle join, and trusted unto God the end of what may come on that great fearful day. What manfulness, what courage, has there e'er been done such deeds like these in all the lands beneath the sun? September 12th, that fateful day, a day of war, a red day marked by blood and killing, screams and gore. Before the sun had risen, that great Christian host began to form, but Mustafa was not asleep and launched the first attack. Their charge fell to the left, where troops imperial were ready for the strike. The boom of guns, the clash of battle, axes struck and swords were swung and stabbed. The Turks were fighting well and with their customary courage, but Duke Charles and all his men knew that the Lord of War was there, the God who led the Hebrews when he'd set them free to spoil great Egypt of its riches for their debt, who slew the traitors of the idol golden calf, who felled the mighty walls of ancient Jericho with marching and the song, the God of Constantine, of good Pelayo, Baldwin and the leper king, and John of Austria was fighting at their side. That Michael, Prince of Angels, Heaven's General, and Santiago Matamoros fought with them. And so, though still outnumbered 2-1, they fought and slowly pushed the Ottomans e'er farther back and forced the Turk to pay a heavy bloody price for every yard the host retook from Turkish arms. And as they fought the field, the Turks attacked the walls. They'd not forgotten fair Vienna still stood strong, that Starhemberg, though starved and weary, still fought on. The city that controlled the Danube was their goal, and they did not neglect it. The 10 mines they'd laid beneath the Leubel Bastei were all set to blow and spell the final doom of fair Vienna town as still a Christian city. But while Charles fought Turks outside the city, Starhemberg's still doughty men found and defused the mines. The Turks now had to fight and win on open fields, and so Mustafa sent and countered nearly all his army. Good Duke Charles, a horse and at the head of all the emperor's men, met that great Turkish charge and broke it. Like a wave, the Turkish army crashed against the imperial shore, and then washed out. But here the emperor gave chase, and as the sun reached noon, though Turks assailed the walls, Duke Charles advanced, and Polish foot upon the right pinned down Mustafa in between their axes sharp and the army of the Duke. The Turks had reinforced one spot to be their stronghold, where they could resist, or so they thought the armies that relieved the town. The Turkenschanze. Mustafa put up a fight, and such a fight that as the afternoon wore on into the evening, Charles could not break through their lines and seize it. Then his men looked to the Kahlenberg, the wooded mountain that o'erlooked the field of war. And as they watched, a sight like which shall ne'er be seen again before this age of history is done. The Sultan's scourge, the source of all jihadi's woe, King John of Poland readied with the final blow. For near 2 centuries, defending Poland's king and Poland's people rode the winged hussars tall. With shining breastplate, brightly polished armor shone on shoulders, arms, and helmet, with a fearsome plume and sturdy jackboots, brightly colored pants and sleeves, the red of blood, their lances long and sharp, their swords were fearsome sabers, and each one bore rounded shield and sharpened axe to use when lances had been broke within the flesh of enemies. And o'er it all great iron wings, with plumage bright above their heads, and from their backs would flutter as they drove their steeds to death and battle. Known and feared the hussars were by Turks and Sultan, for they had met them before upon the fields of Khotan. And on this great day the Sultan at the Turkenschanze fought the Duke and Polish foot to standstill early in the eve beneath the shadow of the mighty Kallenberg. But then, as sun began to wane, above the clash and painful screams of battle, all men heard the horn. The loud and fearsome horn of John, the King of Poles, as he sat fully armed and armored on his horse upon the Kallenberg. And as all faces turned, both Turk and Christian, loudly blew the horn again, and silenced all the battlefield. And at his back, the back of John Sobieski, slowly from the woods, 3,000 winged hussars came and cried their cry of death and battle. And behind the hussars rode some 15,000 horsemen, serving both their king and Christendom, and all that host with sounding horn and battle cry declared their march upon the foe. The Christian infantry gave cheer, the quailing Turks formed up to meet the charge, and Starhemberg within, still undefeated, gathered up his weary men, now filled with vigor and with zeal, and sallied forth to join the fight outside the walls. King John ahorse unset his lance and kicked his horse's flanks and cried and started that great charge down from the Kallenberg. The winged hussars with him, and then all his horse, their mighty steeds still pounding on the battleground, forever to save Christendom from raging Turks, forever to restore all things in Jesus Christ. Down from the Kallenberg that mighty charge did pound, Sobieski at its head, their lances each and all now destined for the flesh of foes. 1,000 pounds each horse and hussar measured down the mountain slope at 30 miles per hour, shining army bright, and plumed wings aflutter in the battle's breeze. Down from the Kallenberg the winged hussars charged, the Turks with every hoofbeat feeling fear arise, their throats a-filling evermore as stomachs rose, their hearts a-pounding louder than the horses' hooves, which grew e'er closer down the mighty mountainside. Down from the Kallenberg the Muslims saw their deaths, their shining plumed glorious deaths approaching fast, like winged angels swooping down from heaven's heights, their lances like the judgment of an angry god, their horses fiery chariots with certain doom. King John was first to sink his lance into the foe as that great wave of hussars hit the Turkish shore and broke it utterly. The Turkish line was crushed and shattered like a pane of glass. The hammer stroked the winged hussars of King John. The infantry, still cheering, pushed their way among the broken lines and fought and slew, and Turks, their force already spent, began to flee. When Starhemberg and Sortie came to join the fight, they broke into a headlong flight, and all of Christendom gave chase and victory. The Christian forces overran the Turkish camp as Turkish forces fled in terror from their arms, abandoning their weapons, tents, their beasts, and wealth, and fleeing desperately, no longer bent on war and conquest, rather mere survival and escape from all the swords of now triumphant Christendom. Brave, weary Starhemberg, unconquered, met King John upon the field of battle and embraced his neck, and kissed him, saying, "Hail, Vienna's saving knight, true heir of great crusaders, John Sobieski, king!" And Louis William Margrave marched with his dragoons into Vienna town and all the love and cheers of those few who remained and had not sallied forth. The spoils of war were huge, for in sheer opulence no people dared outdone the Sultan of the Turks, and wealth beyond imagination would be seized in payment for the misery the Turks had done. And e'en the very tents were seized and cut to size and sewn into fine vestments for the priests of Christ to offer sacrifice of praise for victory and the conversion of the enemies thus fought and beaten on the field beneath the Kallenberg. And as for good King John, as victory was done, he sat down in the tent which had the night before housed Kara Mustafa, the Turkish Grand Vizier, and wrote a letter to the one he loved the most, the woman who had loved him all those weary years and long campaigns of war, his Marusyanka dear, and told her of the feats they'd done at Kallenberg, the victory they'd won at fair Vienna's gates, and praised the Lord his God for bringing them the win, the triumph of the arms of cherished Christendom. And venimus, he said, we came. Indeed they did. Though Habsburgs were a rival and the mighty French would rather see them fall than Christendom arise, and victory was far from certain when he marched to rescue Christendom as she was sore beset and stared right down the barrel of the Turkish gun. And vidimus, he said, we saw. They surely did. They came and saw the fearsome host around the walls which looked as if it never ended, stretching back in numbers without counting from Vienna's gates to old Constantinople, which remained enslaved 200 years away from when it fell to them. And Deus vicit, God has conquered, he did say, reminding all of history that Christian men, unlike the pagan generals of old, will fight not for the sake of fighting, not for bloody arms and stolen loot and stolen land, but for the Lord and for the right will never cease to bear their arms and wet them in the blood of those who seek the death of lands that serve the Christ. What victory, no greater, has been ever known, and yet the victors credited their God alone. The beating suffered by the Turks was so severe they never threatened fair Vienna's gates again, and though their empire would endure some centuries, and many Christians still remained beneath their yoke and suffered the devshirme and the many griefs imposed upon them, they were finally on the fall, and they would lose their Christian vassals one by one. King John himself saved Grau, and then at Parkany freed most of northern Hungary from Turkish swords. And Charles V, the emperor's son, released the rest of Hungary and northern Serbia as well, and then of Transylvania. Mustafa himself, before year's end, received the usual reward of losing some great battle. He was put to death by strangulation with a silken rope, so closed the Sultan's final march to threaten Christian lands. And when the Holy Father Innocent in Rome had heard the news of John Sobieski's victory, and that the army had entrusted all their arms and safety to the Virgin Mother of the Christ, he marked the day of victory, September 12th, a feast of that beloved Virgin's holy name, and named Sobieski as defender of the faith. And so forever after, Christian men could think, remember John Sobieski as he marched to war. Remember how St. Michael marched along his side, with Santiago Matamoros riding south, and Constantine, Pelayo, mighty Charles Martel, and John of Austria, and countless other souls who gave their hands and lives to build up Christendom, and gave their arms to save her from her enemies. So pray for us, St. Michael. Give the strength we need to be the winged hussars that our age requires, and do our own best service for dear Christendom. Remembering, despite her wounds and many scars, she's loyal to and guided by fair heaven's stars. What this poem expresses, the battle, the men, the dates, the places, is all historically accurate in the sense that it is what really happened. It is also poetically accurate in the sense that it adequately expresses the import of each. It is written in blank verse in iambic hexameter with a single rhyming couplet at the end of each stanza to express the main idea of what was just said. The idea is to express both the siege of Vienna of 1683 in all its historical accuracy, but also to express its inspiration, its import, and how the believing Christian ought to feel about it. This is the unique ability of historical poetry, and I hope that more authors will write more of it. Thank you. Until next time, this has been GorPod, the Goretti Publications podcast. Our intro and outro music is Woodland Fantasy by Matthew Pablo, generously released under the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. We have made no changes other than clipping and fading as appropriate. The license is available at creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0, and the song itself is available at opengameart.org/content/woodland-fantasy. Mr. Pablo's website is matthewpablo.com. Our use of this material does not imply his endorsement in any way. This has been the Goretti Publications podcast, gorettipublic.org. Thank you for listening.